Deep reading is a way of describing what happens when we're fully focused on a book, creating connections in our brains and assembling the information inside into knowledge that we can actually use in our lives. But it's not a skill we're born with. We aren't genetically hardwired to read in the same way that we are to form social bonds or acquire languages. And that means it's something we have to learn. And it might be something we're forgetting. Societies in which people could read and write only started to flourish a couple of 100 years ago, and now it feels like they might be dying out again. We read constantly, from adverts to road signs to social media, but increasingly we do it in a superficial way that doesn't have any real relation to the sort of reading that lets us build genuine knowledge and come up with our own ideas. So when we read on screens, for instance, there's often so much information coming at us that we end up skimming. Researchers have identified that we often read in an F shape, where we kind of sample what's at the top of the page, we sample the middle, and then we go to the bottom of the screen. So lesson 1 on deep reading is that it's difficult to do on a screen. But there's a little more to it than that, and it's definitely worth making the effort. So for instance, in his book Everything Bad is Good for You, Stephen Johnson contrasts the huge amounts of neural activity going on in the brains of computer users with the more muted activity in the brains of book readers, and suggests that this might show that books understimulate the senses. But in The Shallows, Nicholas Carr suggests that it's the very fact that book reading is so understimulating that makes it so rewarding. By allowing us to filter out distractions and quiet down our brain's problem-solving frontal lobes, deep reading becomes a form of deep thinking. And so if you've fallen out of the habit, let's talk about 3 ways to get back into it, starting with cluster reading. So if you haven't heard of cluster reading, it's basically reading several books on a related area in order to give you kind of a more holistic understanding of that area. So that might mean reading several books by the same author, or several on the same period of history, or just several from the same genre. And cluster reading on its own is a really effective tool for going deeper on expanding bits of your knowledge. But in my experience, there's kind of another reason to do it. Because once you start kind of vibing with the style of writing from a certain period, then in my experience it becomes a lot easier to read other things from that period. So for instance, last year I read The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, and getting into that kind of dense sentence structure from that era helped me read other books from that era like Jane Austen's Emma and Charlotte Bronte. But then more recently reading the Iliad gave me the kind of mental framework I needed to dive straight into Ovid's Metamorphoses, and then on into the Annals of Imperial Rome. This also works really well with science because once you're familiar with the kind of studies and thinking on a certain area, then you're able to digest anything else from that area more easily and kind of more quickly. But what if the first book in any given area is tough going? Well, that's when you have to treat it like training. So if you go to the gym, you probably don't treat it as something that you can do when you feel like it. You probably have set times and days of the week to go and things you want to accomplish while you're there. Hopefully you see it as important, something you kind of take seriously and you make time for. And you probably don't want reading to feel like this. You want to do it because it's fun or relaxing, like watching TV or playing games. But the thing is, those things will always win over reading because they're designed to be easy. And deep reading is something that takes actual cognitive effort. But there's a secret here that people who work out regularly know. At some point, it starts to be fun. You get confidence in the gym and what you're doing there, you plan ahead and you look forward to what you're going to do, you build up these little habits and routines, and you start to look forward to the endorphin rush you get while you're there. And so by sticking with the gym for long enough and putting in the effort, you make it into something that's fun. And deep reading is basically the same as that. I started to kind of build this new routine recently where I would read as soon as everyone else in my family went to bed at night. And at first it was kind of hard to do that instead of just like putting the TV on and checking out some videos on YouTube. But after a while it became something I looked forward to. It took a little while to get there, but a better way to do that is isolate yourself. So this doesn't mean that you need to read in a quiet room with no distractions. Like, I get some of my best reading done on like trains or on buses or in really crowded coffee shops. What it does mean is isolating your brain from distractions, or those little things that make you less likely to read. There's a pretty good study from the University of Texas that looked at what's known as the phone proximity effect, where they compared the cognitive performance of phone users who either put their phones on a desk, in a pocket or bag, or in another room. And I don't think it's perfect because I think we all know the difference between what it feels like to have a phone like in your pocket, weighing you down, where you kind of know it's there and it's tempting you, versus in a bag where you can kind of forget about it. But the results were pretty clear. The desk group performed worse on both cognitive tests and the other room group performed the best. So what I would strongly suggest is doing whatever it takes to isolate yourself from the internet in particular, whether that means putting your phone upstairs or in a drawer, or preferably in another room where there's not even the cognitive load of just knowing that it's in the sphere where you could go and get it if you wanted to. And if you want to listen to music when you read, then something that I've found super helpful is queuing up a playlist that you already know and like, that you can control just through your Bluetooth headphones without ever looking at a screen. But there's one more way that I'd suggest reading if you can. Because as I mentioned earlier in this video, there's some evidence that reading on a screen convinces our brains to read books in the same way as we read everything else, which means flitting around, getting distracted, and not really taking everything in. But there are a bunch more reasons that I think it's worth reading physical books, and for those I've got a whole video right here. Thanks for watching.